I want to turn now to Russia and Ukraine. There are about to be potential peace negotiations. That is an area where also you have very prominently argued that the story that was told at the beginning of the war to Americans by the Biden administration was essentially false. It was a moralistic story. It was that same kind of story of an aggressor invading its neighbor, and the United States rushing to its defense because we have a principled opposition to aggression, a principled defense of democracy. You argued that this was not, in fact, what was going on, and that first it ignored all of the buildup, all of the ways in which United States policy had contributed to Russia's decision to invade, and that also the United States support for Ukraine, far from being principled, was in fact deeply and disturbingly cynical. And you said that the United States was basically interested in your kind of quote was fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, by which you meant, essentially seeing it as a bargain where the Ukrainians fight and erode the capabilities of our geopolitical adversary, and and our arms industry does very well. It's a great benefit to the United States. So perhaps you could take us, now that we're, I think, probably 2 years past that interview that you did where you explained it. Looking back on the war, what do you think Americans still don't understand about the Ukraine-Russia war?
This war began because of our repudiation of diplomacy. Beginning in 1994, Boris Yeltsin, and then in 2007, but continuously over the years, Vladimir Putin at Munich, at the Security Conference, warned us very consistently that the expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia, in Ukraine, or in Georgia, would draw a military response. And culminating from, in 2014, the United States sponsored a coup d'etat in Ukraine, which installed an anti-Russian government, dominated by Western Ukrainians who are ultranationalists. The first thing they did was to ban the use of Russian for education in the schools or communication with local government, despite the fact that 29% of Ukrainians are native Russian speakers, and that Eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region basically, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson in particular, as well as Crimea, are predominantly Russian-speaking. So that action by Kyiv set off a civil war in Ukraine, in which drew in the Russians, of course, to protect their fellow Russian speakers. From 2014, when the coup occurred, to 2022, when the war began, we restructured the Ukrainian army. On the eve of the Russian invasion, it was 780,000 men. The only army in Europe larger than it was Turkey. It was slightly smaller than the Russian army. And it was poised to mount an invasion of Eastern Ukraine and reclaim the secessionists, Russian-speaking secessionist areas there. So that's the background. And in December 2021, the Russian government put forward an ultimatum. They demanded negotiations on three things. One, to reinstate an agreement Ukraine had repudiated, which would have given a sort of Quebecois type linguistic and cultural autonomy to the Donbass. The Minsk Accords are sponsored by French and the Germans, and in the end revealed by them to be a ploy rather than a serious effort at protecting those people in eastern Ukraine. Second, that Ukraine return to the neutrality, which was proclaimed when it became independent, and on the basis of which Moscow recognized Kyiv as a separate country. And finally, that there be a discussion in Europe of new security architecture that would relieve the Russians of their fear of invasion from the West and relieve the West of their fear of assault by the Russians. We stiff-armed that. We refused to talk about any of that, and therefore the Russians called their bluff, and they then, on February 24th, 2022, actually did invade. A week later, Ukraine and Russia came to a basic agreement They began to negotiate, and in late March, they actually reached an agreement by which Ukraine would return to neutrality, not join NATO. The Minsk Accords would be reinstated, and so forth. We intervened. We went to Kyiv in the person of Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister of the UK, and said, well, to the Ukrainians, well, you may be interested in peace, but we want to weaken and isolate Russia. We think you should fight on. And they did. And the result is that there are probably 1 million dead Ukrainians, a population which was probably 32 million at the outset of the war is now something like 20 million, given the huge exodus of Ukrainians for safe haven, both in Russia, 2.5 to 3 million went to Russia, and the remainder in Western Europe, some in Canada and the United States. So this is not a story of anything but militarism and a lack of diplomatic flexibility and imagination on our part. And we now have the fortunate thing that Mr. Trump has basically forced Ukrainians and Russians to hold a renewed talk in Turkey, in Istanbul, basically on the basis of what they did agree in March or April 2022. This is now 3 years later. There are a huge number of dead for nothing, because the Russians have basically won the war on the ground, and that will establish the parameters of whatever agreement they're ultimately able to reach. So I can say with the Taiwan issue, the thing that we have in common here is that our most charming characteristic is amnesia. We forget what we agreed to or how things started, and we inhale our own propaganda. And we don't even cough when we do it.
Because the story that you've told there, I think, would be characterized by critics as pro-Russian in some ways, or an apologist for Putin is a common term. But
Yeah.
what you're saying there is that actually we betrayed Ukraine. It is Ukraine's interests and Ukraine's people that were ultimately deeply hurt by the U.S. unwillingness, by the U.S. turn away from diplomacy.
Yes, that is exactly right. And the Ukrainians have basically run out of Ukrainians to continue to support our policy. They are collapsing all along the battlefront at the moment. If there is no peace, and a ceasefire is not going to work, because the Ukrainians have their war aims, which are to recover the lost territories, beginning with Crimea and continuing through the Donbass. The Russians have their war aims, which I just described. And there's been a lot of blood and treasure spilled on both sides. The Ukrainians have had the worst of it. But if Ukraine doesn't agree to some sort of peace, it risks being reduced to a landlocked country with no Black Sea coast, as the city of Odessa, which was historically Russian, is regained by Russia. So there's a lot at stake here. And I think the impetus, Mr. Trump has the right idea. If we want to save Ukraine, we've got to have a peace.
There is a report of the Financial Times today saying that the Trump administration, members of the Trump administration, have begun to feel that Vladimir Putin is not seriously interested in peace, and that some of Trump's the kind of premises that Trump sort of more openly interested in diplomacy than the Biden administration was. I mean, constantly talked about how there was a need to try and work out the war, solve it. But that now that they have in fact pushed Russia towards negotiations, they are, I think the Financial Times perspective of it is finding out that Putin actually isn't serious about engaging in discussions in the war. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the Biden administration rejected diplomacy completely with the Russians and others. In the 4 years he was in office, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, never once visited Russia. It's been 5 years since Sergei Lavrov, the very able Russian foreign minister, has been in Washington. So the Trump administration inherited a diplomatic vacuum, but it also inherited something else. And that is that in the absence of diplomatic contact and dialogue, the United States and the West generally, NATO, attributed objectives to the Russians that they never voiced and never had. And so if you enter a negotiation with a complete misunderstanding of what the other side's priorities are, if you imagine, as General Kellogg appeared to imagine, the other envoy of the Trump administration, that the Russians were on the ropes economically, militarily, and otherwise, when the reality was quite the opposite, of course you discover that things aren't the way you thought they were. And I think that's what Vice President J.D. Vance's discovery represents. We are encountering reality. There is an adage in military affairs that you should never lose contact with the enemy, because if you do, the enemy is bound to surprise you. This applies also to diplomacy. If you don't conduct dialogue, if you don't reach out and see the reality, if you imagine the reality, if you engage in fantasy foreign policy, then you cannot successfully deal with the realities that are out there.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs Magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs Podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.